Hi again, everybody. Okay, I'm going to be talking to you again today about Book 10 of Plato's Republic. And as I was saying on Canvas Mail, I anticipate there will be just one more lecture after this one on the Republic. I think that, for the purposes of our course, will mean that we have talked about Plato a lot over these opening weeks of our course. As you guys know, we have been doing this, talking about Plato. First the Ion and now the Republic. Not because it's exactly literary criticism, but because we're trying to get clear about, get onto the table, so to speak. We're after, first of all, foundational concepts, like this concept of mimesis that we introduced and talked about last time. And second of all, foundational questions, which I think we do get very effectively from Plato. Questions which are indeed specifically about literature. And as I have been arguing, one of the interesting and strange things about Plato is that he finds himself actually talking about literature a lot, even though ostensibly it's not what he is after or interested in, and even though Plato's mouthpiece, his philosophical master Socrates, has almost exclusively very negative things to say about literature. So, foundational questions like the relationship between literature and philosophy, the question of whether there is a fundamentally moral or ethical purpose for literature, questions like the validity or the productivity of discussing visual art and linguistic art, such as narrative poetry, in the same breath. Is that or is that not valid? And ultimately, to beat the drum that I keep beating, ultimately the question that really is one of ours in a course like English 216, History and Principles of Literary Criticism, what is literature good for? What makes it any good? And as we have been discussing since the first lecture on Plato, Plato is writing within and writing to a culture that actually rates the intellectual and philosophical and civic and moral role of literature, especially Homer, very, very highly. Plato's Socrates is trying to downgrade that, and it's exactly in that way that we enter into the critical look at literature that it seems Plato cannot ever quite get done with. So that's where we are. Last time, as you know, we were talking about the Platonic concept of mimesis, imitation and representation, and I was outlining the very famous argument that we really need to know about from Plato's Republic 10, his argument against mimesis. As I was saying, it's really, in that part of Plato's thinking, we are really looking at a metaphysical argument, in other words, an argument about how we can understand what basically exists and how we can have an encounter with what basically exists. So it's actually very, very kind of heavy philosophical territory, and whether or not we feel comfortable there, that doesn't matter actually for the purposes of our course. What we need to know and remember is simply that Plato's Socrates advances this argument that art, in particular mimetic art, representational art, takes us farther and farther away from the truth. And I'm not going to start talking about beds and tables again because I talked more than enough about that last time. One little thing there, which I'll just add on to that particular pile that we are now moving away from, one little point which certainly puzzles me about that aspect of Plato's argument, and which perhaps we can talk about in tutorial, is, what would Plato's Socrates say about non-representational art? non-mimetic art. I don't think that the Greeks even would have had anything like what we consider abstract art, but we certainly do. And indeed, various forms of artistic abstraction certainly are basic to the art world and the art market in the modern world. I mean, since the early 20th century. So I'm not quite sure what to do with that, but maybe that's something, again, we can come back to in tutorial. Anyway, Plato's critique is a critique, as we saw last time, directed against mimesis as being metaphysically bad for us, and also epistemologically bad for us, taking us farther and farther away from the truth, by that token, taking us farther and farther away from any possibility of knowledge. Now, as I was saying last time, there are these two other critiques kind of floating in the bucket of Plato's Republic, critiques of art and literature, I mean. One of them is the moral critique. Literature is bad for us in the sense, and it's a simple sense, actually. It's much, much less sophisticated than that whole trippy third removed from reality thing that I was talking about last time. The moral argument that Plato's Socrates makes is, in a sense, much simpler, and it's one with which we're still familiar in various ways, I think, in our culture. It is that literature tends to show bad stuff happening. It shows people behaving badly. It shows bad models of behavior. And the argument that Plato's Socrates advances in that regard very simply is, look, bad literature is a bad influence. It's not good to drive down the road listening to gangster rap. It's not good to watch violent car chases. It's not good to watch pornography. That's another, actually, legacy argument, so to speak, of that particular Platonic attitude. So there's the moral thing, and then there's also, as we have mentioned, there's a critique of subject matter. And if we wanted to kind of have a more elegant word for that, we could say it's an empirical critique, but let's not worry about that. The critique, as you guys know, is that poetry doesn't have its proper subject matter. All it does is kind of dabble in subject matters that really belong to various professions. If you're interested in the subject matter, you go learn about it in the appropriate area of life. If you want to become a carpenter, you don't read what Homer has to say about carpentry. You go study with a blessed carpenter, obviously. If you want to know, to update the example, if you want to know about macroeconomics, let's say, if you want to know, hey man, is globalization basically a good or bad thing? Well, you're going to want to go and inquire about that, I think, in the Department of Economics rather than in a Department of English Literature, for example. That's consistent with that aspect of Socrates' critique. And this particular critique, as I was saying at the end of the last lecture, it does come back in our selection from Plato's Republic, Book 10. And I don't think I'm going to read any of that because it is actually quite familiar territory to us. I'll just summarize rather quickly the tradition, summarize perhaps quickly but more clearly than I have before, the traditional idea in Greek culture that Socrates conceives himself to be arguing against or refuting. It's the tradition, the idea that Homer kind of knows everything. So the Greeks had this view of Homer as just a kind of universal, almost, receptacle or site of knowledge. So you could, they thought, or at least this is a traditional attitude against which Socrates is arguing, the attitude or the idea that you precisely would go to Homer to learn about this or that subject matter. And as a matter of fact, I can tell you This is a conception of Homer that had very, very long legs, historically, so to speak. It comes back certainly in the Renaissance. In the 16th and 17th century, you'll find people in England who explicitly argue that if you want a real education, you got to read Homer, where you'll learn how to do animal husbandry, you'll learn how to captain a ship, you'll learn how to carry out political and military affairs and so on. So Socrates is arguing very much against that. Homer doesn't know about this stuff. He says, come on, if you know about a topic, a subject matter, a thing in the world, well, you go do it, right? Artists, poets, Socrates argues, all they do is they learn just enough to deceive you. So Socrates has this example that a painter will learn just enough about a cobbler, in other words, a shoemaker, that he can paint a cobbler and make you go, yeah, that looks like a cobbler. And maybe in an idea that fascinates, I think, Plato and fascinates the Platonic tradition, maybe a really good painter can even paint a picture of a cobbler that can even make you think that really is a cobbler, but it's a deception. It's taking you farther and farther away from reality, and it's just based on a tiny bit of knowledge of the cobbler's art. And this perhaps is another topic for us in tutorial, the abiding mystery, I think, of let's say creative research. I mean, let's say that you are a budding novelist and you have this great idea. You want to write a novel set, I don't know, in a tank unit in the Second World War. You've got a great idea about that. Let's say a Canadian tank commander. I mean, it could happen in France in the Second World War, and you really, really want to write this story. The only problem is you don't know anything about tanks, right? Let alone about Second World War tanks. Well, you have to go do some research, and novelists and screenwriters and so on do that. And yet, by that token, they don't necessarily become experts in that stuff. They just learn enough to deceive. That would be consistent with the Platonic critique. Now, what I want to do actually in this lecture, for the most part, is I want to go on and I want to push back on several fronts against Plato's Socrates, and I also want to start to suggest, and it's only going to be a suggestion, it's not kind of signed, sealed, delivered by way of learned argument. It's much more like what I hope is a productive and interesting suggestion. And that is to the effect that perhaps there's a way or ways in which Plato himself is pushing back against Plato or pushing back against his Socrates in this part of the Republic. The possibility of an ironic distance between Plato and Socrates, or perhaps between Plato and himself, has always been recognized as a possible way of reading Plato. It remains, I think, to this day in academic philosophy, strictly construed, a somewhat controversial approach to reading Plato. I guess I'm going to suggest that it's in various ways and on various points, let's say, a pretty interesting approach. Making things interesting for ourselves is probably a pretty good strategy when we are reading something as difficult, as dense, as sometimes rambling, as sometimes boring. Let's admit that, as Book 10 of Plato's Republic. So a little bit of pushback, which we can begin quite early in our PDF. It's going to be bottom of page 7 and going on to page 8, where Socrates articulates this kind of rhetorical question, which he wants to put to Homer. And again, we're no longer attacking the rhapsode, we're attacking Homer directly in Republic, Book 10. Socrates has this question that he wants to ask Homer, bottom of page 7. He says, then I said, coming out of the subject matter critique, though, he says, we must put a question to Homer, not about medicine or any of the arts to which his poems only incidentally refer. We're not going to ask him or any other poet whether he has cured patients like Asclepius, or left behind him a school of medicine such as the Asclepiads were, or whether he only talks about medicine and other arts at second hand. But we have a right to know respecting military tactics, politics, education, which are the chiefest and noblest subjects of his poems. And we may fairly ask him about them. Friend Homer, then we say to him, if you are only in the second remove from truth in what you say of virtue, and not in the third, not an image maker or imitator, and if you are able to discern what pursuits make men better or worse in private or public life, tell us, what state was ever better governed by your help? The good order of Lacedaemon, that's Spartus, is due to Lycurgus, and many other cities, great and small, have been similarly benefited by others. But who says that you have been a good legislator to them and have done them any good? And I'll pause there with the direct quotation. A couple of points, suggestions, ideas that I want to put on the table about that. First of all, we're getting kind of a fascinating echo, I think, of the Ion here. Remember, there's that remarkable moment in that much briefer dialogue where the rhapsode Ion, having been attacked and attacked and attacked by Socrates as to what the actual subject matter of literature is, he actually comes up with an answer, which Ion gives in both kind of a ridiculous and a non-ridiculous form. The slightly ridiculous form, or perhaps very ridiculous form, that he gives is when Ion claims to be the same as a general. The rhapsode is the same as a general. And we had a really good discussion about that and Kanye West and related matters in the last tutorial, I think. But the less ridiculous or non-ridiculous version of that answer, as you may recall, that Ion gives, is when he says, okay, well, the literature, the poet and the rhapsode will know what a man and a woman ought to say, what a ruler ought to say, and what a slave ought to say. And I'm paraphrasing, it's a bit richer than that, but it's that kind of thing. And as I said, when we looked at that, what we have there, I think, is Ion groping toward a kind of insight that, well, you know, maybe the appropriate subject matter or purpose or proper expertise of literature, maybe it's something to do with society. Maybe it's something to do with morality, with ethics, with civics, with politics, all tied back to this notion of what and how people ought to speak and express themselves depending on their roles in the very hierarchical world of the ancient Greeks, even ancient Athens. So it's an obscure insight, perhaps, but one that again has a long tradition, for which I'm not advocating. I'm only kind of entering it into evidence, you see. A long tradition, which is still with us to some extent, that ultimately the purpose of art is moral. Ultimately, the purpose of literature is moral, and ultimately, perhaps in some way that we can't easily articulate, but ultimately, if you're actually gonna be a Homer, or a Shakespeare, or a George Eliot, or whoever, what you're really gonna be is somebody who is seeing into the way societies ought to work, how people ought to behave, and maybe we'd be able to make some sense of that as an appropriate or proper subject matter for literature. Maybe if we even squint a little bit at that insight and at this passage in Republic 10 that I just read, maybe if we squint a little bit, we'll even perceive the tradition of what used to be called liberal education, right? Again, the deeply felt and yet perhaps obscure belief or faith that young people should go to the university and just learn some stuff for a few years because it will make them citizens. It'll make them fully well-rounded adults and thinkers, and that literature will have a central role in that, even though we may find it difficult to articulate exactly what that role is. And again, I'm not advocating for that. I'm just putting it on the table. And I'm pointing out that it emerges here a little bit from Socrates' own critique, his subject matter-based critique of what the heck literature is for, what the heck it is about. And this rhetorical question that Socrates imagines, asking Homer, what state have you ever founded? What civilization, O Homer, is your work? For what culture can you claim credit? I think the Greeks, answering for Homer, might well turn to Socrates and go, well, this one. This one is the culture, the civilization that is shaped by Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. So, as I said, it's a little moment here where perhaps we're starting to see a bit of a pushback, or perhaps Socrates saying stuff, making arguments in denigration of literature that may be weaker than they at first appear, or may even be, on closer examination, these arguments may even be operating at cross, excuse me, at cross purposes to themselves, and going on. We can perhaps then come back to a much more fundamental question about Republic 10, which we've already asked in various ways, which is, if literature is so pointless, Socrates, if it's so alienated from the proper work of knowledge, which is the work of philosophy, what is it even doing here? Why do you keep coming back to it? Why, indeed, does the question of literature and of art, even more broadly, form a continuing theme or issue at the very conclusion of this work, Plato's Republic? Remember, we're reading the last book of Plato's Republic, and literary issues take up the conclusion of that book. So that's just kind of weird. This literature obsession that Plato-Socrates seems to have. As I said last time, he's already dealt with this once earlier in the Republic, in Republic Book 2. Comes back in Republic Book 10, and even within Book 10, he keeps dealing with it, and it keeps coming back. That obviously suggests that there is a residue in the literature question that Socrates in some way is failing to deal with, even though he keeps claiming to have dealt with it decisively and once and for all. Now, I was saying a moment ago, from Socrates' own critique, we can perhaps begin to draw the idea that there may be a moral purpose or vocation for literature and literary study. And we can connect that, I want to connect that, to the way in which the whole argument of the Republic wraps up, which is via a return to the moral question that I've talked about earlier. The moral agenda of the whole Republic, which, as you will recall from the last lecture, is about the nature of justice. Justice in a very broad sense doesn't mean positive law or anything like that. It means being good, being just, being virtuous. Goodness, rightness, virtuousness, all of that kind of stuff. Being a good guy, good person, I should say, forgive me. Being a good person is what is involved in the question of justice in Plato's Republic. As we come to the almost conclusion of our work, yes, we're going to go all the way to page 27 in our PDF. Forgive me for stalling there for a sec. I'm skipping over a little bit, but basically, as we draw toward the conclusion of the work, Socrates' critique of literature returns to moral questions, and fundamentally, he kind of rests on this claim that literature is bad for us. Literature is going to get us too excited, and excited in the wrong ways, and thereby it's going to make us neglect justice and virtue. That's what Socrates says. So we kind of go right back to the beginning of his argument from much earlier in the Republic. Literature just contains bad moral content. All we can admit in the ideal state is hymns of praise of gods and famous men. That's all. Because, again, the overriding and the continuous issue in Republic is the nature of justice, how we can secure justice, so to speak, how we can know that we are being just and know that justice is, so to speak, the right strategy. And the language in which Socrates and Glaucon come back to this question round about page 27 of our PDF, the language they're using in our version of the text, it's a little bit hard to grasp, a little bit hard to follow. They're talking about the appearance of justice. They're talking about the idea that justice should not only be sort of theoretically right, but should also look right. So I want to paraphrase, I think, in simpler terms, what they're trying to get at. What they're trying to get at, I think, is the idea that justice, being just, being a good person, it shouldn't just be something that we can argue for on a moral basis. It should also kind of be something that we can't ignore. In life, I mean. It should be the case that justice pays. It should be the case that injustice doesn't. That's, in the last analysis, what it comes down to. And the worry, of course, the totally intelligible and ordinary and real worry with which they have actually been dealing indirectly since the very beginning of Plato's masterwork, The Republic. The worry is that that won't be true. Justice won't necessarily pay. Injustice may pay. The unjust may prosper. The unjust man, the wicked man, the greedy man, the vicious man, the cruel one, the unjust person may do great in life, may make a lot of money, have fancy houses, gorgeous clothes, even while hurting people and killing people and cheating people. The unjust man may prosper. And the worry here is not only that it will be unfair, you know, there's that unjust guy doing great while you know, little just you're squirreling away in a corner, just barely making ends meet. The issue is not only that that's fair, the issue, of course, is that you are vulnerable to the power of the unjust person who prospers. And the terrible possibility, therefore, emerges that you may have to kind of give up on justice a little bit. Maybe some other value will have to be admitted, a value like power or survival or pleasure, or even the formulation that I shared with you guys last time, justice in the sense of helping your friends and harming your enemies, a kind of mafia conception of justice and morality. How can we know that that's not right? That's the question that has been animating this discussion from the beginning, and it's a question to which they return at the end. And Socrates, and I'm now on page 28, 29. Socrates basically says to Glaucon, with respect to this worry about the unjust people prospering, just people not prospering, Socrates offers this claim, which is really kind of a nice little story. He says, well, look, obviously the gods like the just, right? Sure. Well, if the gods like the just, they must be friends to the just, right? Sure. Well, if the gods are the friends of the just, then obviously the just will do great in life and the unjust will do badly in life. This is the claim that Socrates advances at this point in Republic 10. And you hear that and you go, Really? I'm not going to read it because it'll take too long. But Socrates, it's on page 28, 29 in our PDF. Socrates goes into a long thing about, well, look, it may seem that for a while unjust people are doing well. But in the end, they suffer. In the end, they get what's coming to them. That happens for sure. It may seem for a while that just people are not doing well, that just people are not being treated fairly in life. But in the end, the just people all get their right rewards. This is the claim that Socrates advances at this very late stage of the Republic. And I think that when Plato puts those words in the mouth of Socrates, I think that so now I'm arguing something stronger than I said I was going to argue. I think that we have seriously to consider the possibility of an ironic distance opening up in Plato's text, because of course, who is Socrates? Historically, Socrates is Plato's philosophical master, the guy who went around Athens urging people to try to live the examined life, urging people to be sober and moderate and virtuous and just. What happened to Socrates? Just good Socrates was tried and put to death by the Athenian state for corrupting the youth of Athens through exactly those teachings. So Socrates himself, you see, is the counter-example, the counter-argument to the argument that Socrates is making. It is manifestly not true. Then as now, that the just necessarily prosper, the unjust necessarily suffer. We know that's not true. And it is accordingly a very kind of odd and unstable moment in Plato's text when Socrates makes exactly that claim. And it gets yet more stable and yet more interesting as we move into the very concluding phase of our reading, the almost standalone story with which the whole Republic concludes. The whole masterwork comes to an end with this story. It's the famous story known as the myth of and that's what I want to talk about for the remainder of the lecture. Having just advanced this claim, this ridiculous claim, that just people always prosper, unjust people always suffer. It's as though the text implicitly recognizes, there may be a problem with that. And so we take a step back, or maybe a better metaphor is we take a step farther. Okay, maybe it's not the case that justice and injustice are always rewarded in this life. Well, what about in the next life? Of course, Socrates and his friends have, at this point in the text, they've just concluded a very complicated, what Socrates advances as a proof of the immortality of the soul. Okay, what happens after death to the just and the unjust? This is the final question with which the Republic is concerned, and it's a question that Socrates answers with this myth of And I'm just basically going to summarize this story that Socrates tells. He claims to be telling a story that originates with a person who kind of had a near-death experience, a warrior called E-R, who goes to the afterlife, learns what it's like, and then came back to tell people what it's like, and Socrates supposedly is relating this report. And the basic idea of the myth of is that after death, souls are judged. So, the basic idea is justice, in other words. After death, Socrates tells Glaucon, everybody gets judged based on their actions in life. And all souls after death, Socrates says, have to wander for 1,000 years. People who were good in life, who were just and virtuous and nice, they get to spend 1,000 years wandering in heavenly regions, basically enjoying themselves. People who were jerks in life, the unjust, they have to spend 1,000 years wandering, as Plato puts it, beneath, beneath the earth. So it's a kind of underworld. After this 1,000-year period of wandering, Socrates says, all the souls kind of reemerge in the kind of lobby, if you like, of the afterlife, and they are sent to choose new lives, and they are reborn to live again, except for the really wicked people, because they don't get to be reborn at all. They're grabbed by, demons and harpies, and they're dragged away kicking and screaming to hell. So you see, Socrates is telling us, after death, unjust people are punished twice. They have to suffer for 1,000 years, and then if they were really, really bad, they then have to suffer for eternity. That's the first part of the story. And in its full-fledged form, which we don't really have time to manage very well, Plato tells a whole complex astronomy, which he's thought about clearly a lot, about how the earth works. It's turning on a spindle, and there's various parts that fit together, and where heaven is and where hell is, and so on. We can pass over that, although I will have something brief to say about it later on. But in the end, as I said, the idea is that all the souls get to choose another life, and they get to choose. You see, that's critical. They then are reborn. And I'm just going to, before I comment on the myth of I'm just going to read the very, very conclusion of Socrates' story, which is then perforce the very conclusion of our reading and of the entirety of Plato's Republic, where Socrates wraps up by saying, "And thus, Glaucon, the tale has been saved and has not perished, and will save us if we are obedient to the word spoken, and we shall pass safely over the river of forgetfulness, and our soul will not be defiled. Wherefore, my counsel is that we hold fast ever to the heavenly way, and follow after justice and virtue always, considering that the soul is immortal and able to endure every sort of good and every sort of evil. Thus shall we live dear to one another and to the gods, both while remaining here and when, like conquerors in the games who go round to gather gifts, we receive our reward. And it shall be well with us, both in this life and in the pilgrimage of 1,000 years, which we have been describing." And that's where the Republic ends. Now, a couple of comments on this incredible text, text within a text, if you like, Plato's Myth of First, and this is kind of a general point, even more general than is directly relevant to our course, but it's just so interesting. In terms of what we can call intellectual history or the history of ideas, I think there's no question that Plato's Myth of is one of the most influential and important texts in the history of the world. One of the most fascinating texts as well. I mean, where the heck is Plato even getting this from? He's making up this story, the myth of from various materials. Probably he's influenced, I would say, by non-Greek religion, perhaps by Egyptian mystery religion, perhaps by Judaism, and perhaps more importantly, Plato's Myth of massively influences other religion, massively influences Christianity, the coming of Christianity. We're about 500 years when we're reading Plato's Republic before Christianity emerged as an organized religion in the Middle East and Europe, and in various ways there's been a very intimate relationship between Christianity and Platonism at various ways and various points in the development of Christianity and of medieval Christian Europe. The book of Revelation, the final book in the Bible, I would say the author of that book has definitely read Myth of or at least knows of it. There are many, many echoes of Plato there, and the very idea of hell and of judgment. as it develops in medieval Christianity. If we trace back that idea, the tradition of that idea, we're going to trace it back to the Bible, yes, but we can also trace it back, I think, to Plato's myth of Ur. So that's just, I think, fascinating on its face, even though that's a kind of intellectual history window that we can only open up and glance through. In our course, we can't deal with it properly. But I added to the Canvas page just one example of what this judgment tradition becomes, and that is the Christian vision of the Last Judgment as it is depicted by Michelangelo on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. One more tiny point in this kind of intellectual history stuff. I mentioned that Plato comes up with a whole really complex astronomy to describe how this rebirth process works, involving the fates and so on and so forth. He's making it up. Later, in medieval Europe, in various areas, this story was actually taken to be true. So Plato's invented astronomy for the myth of Ur enters into actual astronomical traditions. So it's really weird and fascinating and amazing. But that we kind of leave to one side. I just wanted to glance at that. There's more. There's two other points that I want to wrap up with about the myth of Ur, which are much more directly relevant to our course. And in a way, they're not that difficult, but I think they are important. And here's the first point. We are coming to the end of the Republic. We're at the end of the Republic. And as we have seen, Socrates has repeatedly advanced this very, very negative critique of literature along several lines that we have now, I think, illuminated pretty effectively. And yet, at the same time, and absolutely transparently, this whole work comes to an end with a story, with a fiction. And really, it's like a bedtime story that Socrates tells, including that wonderful resonant conclusion. It'll all be fine, Glaucon, as long as we follow virtue and justice. It's a bedtime story. The whole work, the whole argument of the Republic winds up on something, on a text that is transparently literary, transparently a work of literature. And I think we could even argue that the whole work depends on this work of literature, this invented story which assures us that in the end, cheaters don't prosper. In the end, justice will prove to be the right strategy, even if we have to wait all the way until the afterlife for that to turn out to be true. And the second and concluding point, which I'm going to have to make fairly briefly, and we'll come back to it in tutorial, okay? It has to do with the notion of rebirth in Plato's myth of Ur. That is what happens to all souls in the afterlife, except, of course, those super wicked ones. Everybody else gets to choose their next life. And that aspect of choosing, of course, is critical. Socrates' philosophy is meant to explain the nature of the examined life, the philosophical life, the moral life, the just life, and is meant to show people that that's really the life that they have to choose and they should choose. But it's a choice. Otherwise, it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't make any difference. You can choose to be violent and sensual and selfish and so on. Or you can choose to be philosophical and moral and virtuous. That's what it's all about in Plato. And that choice precisely returns in the afterlife story that Socrates tells in the myth of Ur. All these souls get to choose their next life. And we can come back to this in tutorial. It is a very rich literary touch that Plato has worked into the conclusion of his masterwork. Because the way people choose, the way the souls choose their next lives is for the most part reactive. It's for the most part kind of dysfunctional and weird. There's a whole bunch of heroes from the Homeric myths who choose to become animals, for example, because they're like, ugh, that human existence, that was just too much trouble. They choose to become animals. That can't be right. Odysseus himself, the great Homeric hero, appears in the afterlife and in a wonderful episode within Plato's myth of Odysseus, by chance, has to choose last because they're all kind of lined up randomly, these souls, in terms of the order in which they get to choose their next lives. Odysseus has to choose last, and what does he do? He looks around and around and around at all the all the lots, all the tokens of next lives that are still lying around on the floor of the afterlife, and he chooses to become, I don't remember the exact words, but he chooses to become a really, really trivial, boring person who has a very unexciting life. You know, an accountant, maybe, or a bookkeeper, a clerical worker. Odysseus chooses that because he really wants a calm life. He doesn't want to be a hero anymore. It's too much work. It's too scary. What I'm trying to get at is that we get, for the most part, in the myth of scene where the souls choose their next lives, we mostly get souls making choices that appear to be ill-chosen. We appear to get souls ricocheting reactively into lives that they're going to find they regret all over again, just in different ways than they regretted their last lives. And on that point, we've just mentioned Odysseus, who chooses last in this scene that Plato gives us. We can now go back to the person who chooses first, because I think the suggestive point of this episode emerges very clearly here. So I'm at the top of page 35 in our PDF, where the first person who gets to choose comes forward. The first soul gets to choose its next life. So at top of page 35, just a couple more minutes here. He who had the first choice came forward, and in a moment chose the greatest tyranny. he chooses to become, a dictator. He chooses the big house, the gold Benz, the thriving drug trade, all that stuff. In a moment he chose the greatest tyranny. His mind having been darkened by folly and sensuality, he had not thought out the whole matter before he chose, and did not at first sight perceive that he was fated, among other evils, to devour his own children. But when he had time to reflect, and saw what was in the lot, he began to beat his breast and lament over his choice, forgetting the proclamation of the prophet. For instead of throwing the blame of his misfortune on himself, he accused chance and the gods and everything rather than himself. Now he was one of those who came from heaven, and in a former life had dwelt in a well-ordered state. But his virtue was a matter of habit only, and he had no philosophy. Socrates says, this is somebody who came from a well-ordered state, the kind of state guided perhaps by one of Plato's philosopher kings. This is one of the people who has just spent 1,000 years wandering in heaven. He's one of the good ones. And yet he makes a terrible choice, the most terrible possible choice, to have a life living in the greatest tyranny, which also turned out to be a life of very tremendous pain. Socrates' comment is, he had no philosophy. Maybe we could be forgiven for supposing that instead a person like that had no literature, had not read any stories, watched any Breaking Bad, seen any gangster films. This person has not had the opportunity to explore in fiction, in narrative, in literature, in art generally, what good and bad pathways in life might be. So again, we have some very interesting possibilities, and that's all I'm really going to claim in the end. some very interesting possibilities for ironic distance or pressure in this work between Plato and Socrates, between Plato and himself. And I think the possibility that ultimately emerges if we explore that distance, the possibility that actually emerges in the end is that Plato is making an argument for literature, for literary education, precisely along that moral vector, as a way for us to choose the examined life, maybe a way that is richer than the philosophical pathway laid down by Socrates, maybe a way that is more effective than that pathway. And again, the strongest suggestion of that, to make the point one more time, the strongest suggestion in favor of that view is that Socrates himself, in the end, he has to close this deal, finish this work, tie this ribbon with a literary tour de force, the myth of Ur, rather than with some decisively or definitively rational philosophical argument. Okay? Okay, I'm going to stop this one there, and I will see you guys in tutorial. As I was saying, we'll have one more lecture on Plato. That will be plenty, I think, and that will return us actually to that foundational, tantalizing concept of mimesis. Okay? But bye for now.